delighted to have you here. It's been a crazy year. It's been, the pandemic, over 100,000 deaths, and the senseless deaths that we've had just tears at your heart. And I would ask each one of you to reach out every day this week to somebody that you haven't talked to in a good while, a family member or a friend, going way back. I would encourage you to do that and just reach out and ask them how they're doing. And, many of you may already be doing this, but I just think it's a genuine time to reach out and let people know that you're thinking about them, and go the extra mile to be kind to people. And we are so glad to have Bob Franklin with us. Margaret and I first got to know him and Cheryl on the Orient Express, which was a great experience. And like so many of the PathNorth events, that was really a wonderful one. But I'm going to introduce our founder first of all, and Doug has a few things he wants to talk about. As you all know, Doug is a graduate of a Tar Heel, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, and has had a distinguished career, and has just published a new book. And he's a wonderful guy and a wonderful friend. And so I'll turn it over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Secretary Dalton, and thank you all for joining us. Some of you, this is the first time. This luncheon was envisioned by Margaret and John Dalton, and they sponsor it when we used to have luncheons in person, and Adam Kaufman was a part of helping to shape that, so we appreciate all of you. This is a really important cultural moment right now, and I want to say a couple things about it. One is, I think this is a time for listening. This is a time to really hear the pain of what people are saying. I think the tendency is to want to pivot and do something big to counter certain things. And I think we need to listen to the pain and what's being said and what's not being said. So I'd start there. And I want to just tell a quick story. When I was on the White House staff, in the middle of the apartheid challenge with South Africa, I brought 12 presidents of African-American, historically Black colleges into the Oval Office to meet with Ronald Reagan, my boss. And it was an extraordinary hour where he listened. He really listened well and asked probing questions. And it really affected our policy because he was not defensive. He just said, I want to know the truth as you're perceiving it as people of color. I think we need to hear that. I think we also need to hear something else. I was talking to a chairman of a large company last night. He's a man of color, and he said, Doug, my son just went through a flashback tonight. I said, what do you mean? He said he was at Georgia Tech. He was driving home. The cops pulled him over, slammed him down on the concrete, and 4 of them cocked their guns and put it at his head and said, you look like a drug dealer to me. He was an engineering student at Georgia Tech. I think most of our men and women of color have either children or they have personal experience with this. We need to hear it. I have 3 boys. I never once think about that. Dale Jones said he thinks about that all the time with his son. I think we need to hear about that. The last thing I'd say, I reread an important letter that Martin Luther King wrote when he was in the Birmingham jail. It's famously called the Letter from a Birmingham jail. He penned it April 16th, 1963. And in that letter, it was a response to the ministers of Birmingham who had said, Dr. King, you're going too fast. You've got to slow down. You know, we're against racism and Jim Crow laws, but we can't go too fast. And this is a powerful statement in response that he honored what they said, but also helped them go to a deeper level. I'm sending that out this afternoon to all of you, so you'll have that. I'd urge you to reread it. He urged people to step up to their moral responsibility, to disobey unjust laws, and to take action where you need to. And he said this, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. And I'd say lastly, one of the challenges as a former Republican, I would say, we have as sometimes believers and as Republicans, we equate personal, individual love and care toward people of color with systemic change. They're very different. So I would say ponder this. There's a difference because everybody like me that looks like me can get defensive and say, well, I've always been kind to people of color. That's not the issue. There are systems. There's a mentality in systems that are marginalizing people of color. So these are things that I'd ask us to think about. Closing with John 1:1-14, where the trouble today I think we have is somehow combining truth-telling with love. And I think there's a powerful way to think of it, and it's in John chapter 1, New Testament, verse 1 and 14 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Then it says the Word became flesh, Jesus, dwelt among us. Then it says this, full of grace and truth, full of absolute love and absolute truth-telling. Somehow in our faith, we can bring those two seemingly contradictory notions together. With that, I will pass the baton to my dear brother, Dale Jones, who's the CEO of Diversified Search, a great force for good in the world. Mr. Jones. Is Dale on mute?
I think so.
Okay, here I am. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate your thoughts there. And John and Margaret, I don't know of two individuals who are worthy of the honor of this civility gathering, because the two of you live your lives across partisan lines and between the wealthy and the poor and the believing world and the unbelieving world in a way that this civility gathering is such a tribute to you in terms of how you live your lives. But I also have to apologize to our speaker today, because I don't think Robert knew that the world would be in such turmoil today when we asked him to talk about civility. And yet, last night, I live a mile from the White House. All night, I heard sirens and helicopters reminding us through the night of the trouble that we're in and what we feel, why we feel what we feel, and why we're afraid of what we're afraid of. And so, Robert, my apologies ahead of time that you're on the hook for today, but perhaps it is providence that brings you to share with us today. Many of you know that Robert is a graduate of Morehouse College, as I am. He served as the president of the college for a number of years and did great things there. In addition to serving as president of the college, you should know that he graduated from Morehouse and then went on to the University of Chicago, to Harvard for his Master's of Divinity, and then to the University of Chicago for his PhD. He's been a program officer with the Ford Foundation. He's been the president of the seminary, president of Morehouse, and assistant to the president of Emory. He's been the religious director at Chautauqua, which is a great gathering of business and civic leaders to talk about the issues of faith. Robert has written 4 books, and his most recent book is titled Moral Leadership. I don't know of a better time for us to read Robert's book and pass it on to others than today, where he talks about how critical moral leadership is for the world in which we live. And so the beauty is we will hear from him now. He's married to Dr. Cheryl Goffney, who is a physician, and they are iconic figures in Atlanta. But also, I'll tell you, my sense of Robert is that if I were describing him in a religious term, it would be prophet. But in the more perhaps modern day term, it would be oracle, someone who speaks truth that is often given through divine instinct and revelation for the times. And Robert, I think you being our oracle today is a gift for us to somehow sense how do we make sense out of a world that seems to be running out of control. And so I will leave it there. Robert and his wife also have 2 children, a son and a daughter, both who are very well educated and well learned. By the way, Robert coined a term called the Renaissance man for Morehouse. And he said there were 5 wells that every young man needed to have. He needed to be well dressed. He needed to be well read. He needed to be well traveled, well spoken, and well balanced in his life. And those 5 wells have been inculcated into my own son, who went to Morehouse, who left is in Columbia as a Fulbright scholar and working, and was a mentor to our son, Jordan, while he was a student in Morehouse. So Robert, please take us to where we need to go today, because we're all troubled and need some hope.
Thank you a great deal, Dale. You've been a dear friend, you and Yolanda, to me and Cheryl. We're very grateful for that. I also want to thank Doug Holliday, who has been a remarkable bridge leader, bringing people together from various sectors. I mean, as I look at page after page here before me of this kind of, stars of business, education, religion, nonprofit sector, and the arts, and so on. We are here in some measure because of people like Doug and organizations like PathNorth. Cheryl and I have been proud to be a part of PathNorth for many years now, and Doug was a former board member at Morehouse College. I also want to thank Melanie and Seth and the staff team at PathNorth, and Adam and others who've been terrific leaders in these conversations each week. I generally sit quietly and listen, but boy, I've learned so much. And I've invited, along with you, Doug, and others, many other new friends to this conversation today, because we all are grappling with this moment in history. Also, a special word of thanks, reciprocating Secretary John and Margaret Dalton's kind words. It was a real delight to get to know them. I think we've been on 2 very special international trips with PathNorth, and I often tell my friends at Emory that we are something of a kind of a set of citizen ambassadors to the world as we travel about and meet with significant leaders in the various sectors in the countries we visit. And so thank you, Secretary Dalton and Margaret, for your vision and for the compassionate and wise leadership you've brought that makes this forum today possible. There are many dear friends here, and I just want to acknowledge my current colleague and boss at Emory University is on the line, President Claire Stirk, who's done a phenomenal job of connecting a world-class university like Emory to an extraordinary city like Atlanta. And there are many friends from around the country, from Chautauqua and the 10 and other organizations that are very dear to my heart. So thank you all. I think Dr. Walter Massey, my predecessor, is going to be joining the call, as is Dr. Jim Laney, who was the president at Emory when I was hired. Well, Martin Luther King said in a wonderful collection of sermons, for those of you who want to read more during these days, and I know, Doug, thank you for making King's letter from Birmingham jail available to us, but he has a collection of sermons titled Strength to Love. And one of the sermons there is titled Transformed Nonconformists. And he says these words that haunt me during the past week. Dr. King said, "This hour in history needs a dedicated circle of transformed nonconformists. This hour in history needs a dedicated circle of transformed nonconformists. The saving of our world from pending doom will come not from the action of an adjusted majority, but from the creative maladjustment of a transformed minority." And so that's an extraordinary phrase to think about, how a relatively small number of dedicated citizens, of transformed nonconformists, can make a huge difference in the direction of history. And I think we're at one of those moments here. And I think, again, the people on this call now and the 4 or 5 people each of you knows who are change makers and thought leaders, we could really make something important happen at this time in this nation that we love. So this was an opportunity before, the recent dramas and challenges unfolded. I was supposed to talk a little about my story and really to highlight a couple of books that have been important to me. Let me just mention, for those of you who don't know, Doug Holliday has penned a wonderful book, Rethinking Success. And he highlights a number of the virtues, especially for people who've been focused on success, to begin to think about living lives of significance. And I really celebrate Doug and all I've learned from that book, virtues like cherishing the relationships in your life, the importance of forgiveness, of keeping an open mind, etc. I also, as Dale mentioned, I've just published a little book, Moral Leadership, and so it's an opportunity to think a bit about what difference moral leadership can make, a quality of authentic leadership, a dimension of effective leadership that I'm sure you all have had occasion to reflect on, that can really, really make a significant difference in the direction of an organization. So let me just offer, I opened the book with, and this is where I was going to start with my story. I was a product of a wonderful family, oldest of 6 kids in a working class Black family on the south side of Chicago. My parents were migrants from Mississippi. Many of you know, for most African Americans in the South who moved to the Midwest, North, and Western parts, it was often a 2-part movement. That is, the first stage was the move from the rural South. These were the farms where our ancestors and families worked, free labor as enslaved labor, and then later cheaply paid labor as sharecroppers, from that rural South to the urban South. So you see the growth of cities like Memphis and Atlanta and Charlotte and so. But then for many, not all obviously, many other African Americans made that second move from the urban South to the urban North. And so my family landed in Chicago. And it was there that my grandmother, we lived with her until my parents could earn enough to purchase their own home. She had a small garden next to her house on the south side of Chicago. This is before, urban gardens were in vogue. She felt it was important for families to eat fresh fruits and vegetables, not to eat out of cans, which was the real thrust of modern life for many of our family members. And all that comes to a story with which I opened the book. One day I saw 2 groups of young, muscle-bound men, apparent gang members, about to come to fisticuffs right in front of our house on the street. I was 8 or 9 years old. My grandmother, who was an active church leader, she was a home missionary, as they were called in our church, was in the kitchen preparing fresh food from her garden next door, a small backyard garden. And she heard the ruckus, and she ran out of the house into the street and stood before these 2 groups of young men. And I thought, oh my God, what's about to happen now? And she began to talk to them. She listened to their pain and hurt, but she said, you know, no one is going to fight here today. No one is going to get hurt. I know what it means for a mother to receive that phone call that your son has been injured, has been shot. And I received that call when my son was serving in the US military in Italy during World War II. And no mother wants to receive that. And I have fed all of your families probably from this little garden. So no one is going to get hurt here. And I watched these tough, muscle-bound, you know, homeboys look at each other and look at her and look at each other and look at her, and they began to back away. And they all walked away. There was no violence that day. There were other families in that block who were watching timidly from their front porches, but one woman put her body in between those groups of young men who intended violence, and it was dissipated. Now, to be sure, they would choose another day to fight, but not there, not that day. For me, that was the embodiment of what I'm calling in this little book, moral leadership. It was the power of personal integrity, it was courage, and it was imagination. The way she spoke to them. She could have been killed. She certainly ruined my reputation that day. But I wondered, what is she about to do here? And so I'm extracting those three virtues for this moment in history, that we need leaders of integrity, where your deeply held values are aligned with your behavior, your investments, your organization and company's direction. Integrity, courage, that you step forth in moments of challenge. C.S. Lewis said, courage isn't just one of the values, many virtues. Courage is not one of the virtues. It is the form of all the virtues at the point of testing. So all of the virtues resemble courage when they are brought to the testing point. And then that third one, imagination, bringing creative approaches to community problem solving, knowing the names of the kids in the neighborhood. As Doug said, listening, even when it's a new subject, when it's an uncomfortable space. For President Reagan to have listened to those leaders. Later years when President Clinton stood in a town hall meeting and asked leaders after a police shooting then, what do we need to know? What does the government need to be thinking about? So that's a demonstration of a kind of imagination that I admire. I watched Chicago burn in 1968. That was the year, as you all know, and you know, where were you on April 4, 1968? Martin Luther King assassinated. It was freshman year in high school, and I watched that unfold in the distance. You all have been to Chicago. You know how flat the plains of the prairies of Illinois and the Midwest are. I could see, I was 25 miles from downtown Chicago, but I could see fire and smoke just an hour after I heard of that assassination. And I thought, gosh, what we need leadership like the kind that my grandmother demonstrated at that time. And how can I step into that role? So I took all of that experience to Morehouse College as an undergrad student. I was drawn to Morehouse because of Dr. King's biography. I learned more of that during that time of his the memorial. Recall that 5 days after his assassination, on April 9, 1968, the funeral service occurred in two parts. First, a small elite gathering in Ebenezer Baptist Church, tiny church, seated 400 or 500 people. But then they marched along with that mule-drawn casket to the campus of Morehouse College, 2 or 3 miles away. And there they had an open public memorial. The former president of Morehouse, Benjamin Mays, over my shoulder, I'm sitting in my home office. That's a picture of Dr. Mays there. He was asked to come back. He had retired the year before to deliver the eulogy for his favorite student. And that deeply impressed me, and I wanted to be a part of that Morehouse experience. While at Morehouse, I got a chance, I received a junior year abroad scholarship. and became a kind of internationalist, a globalist at that time, as I spent a year at Durham, England, then over to visited the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union, and to Spain and Morocco. And I returned and graduated from Morehouse. And then the great privilege of my life to return years later as president of that college. And it helped me understand how an institution, how an organization, how a company can be a moral leader, can lift up certain values and virtues for a community, and can really move and sway the community. In part, I've got a couple of friends here from Coca-Cola on this call. It's what Coca-Cola did when King received in 1964 the Nobel Peace Prize. He was returning to Atlanta, and none of the major companies wanted to embrace Dr. King. Here, the world was celebrating him. He's coming to his hometown, and there would be no big ceremony. And the leaders at Coca-Cola said, no, this will not stand. If we're to remain in Atlanta, we're going to show the world how Atlanta appreciates authentic moral leadership. So I really want to, again, just lift up the importance of that kind of leadership. And in chapter 3 of the book, I open with a story of Larry Fink and his letter to CEOs. Now, I'm not a business guy, and I'm an amateur learning from you experts, but I was very moved by what he has been doing in his annual letters to CEOs. And I hope you'll take a look at that, and I thank Dale Jones for introducing me to that work. Well, let me just cut to our current moment, since King challenges us and invites us. I think all of our hearts are burdened with this moment of where we are now, because in a sense, we're already grappling with the global pandemic, and Corona has deeply impacted our lives. When you think about it, 40 million Americans, our fellow citizens, unemployed. A lot of those folks feeling desperate about rent, paying rent, about feeding their families, about what happens next, and feeling the volatility and the uncertainty of daily life. So that was sort of already the new normal, the status quo. Kids out of school. Suddenly, here's enormous numbers of high school and college students who were abruptly sent home. Free time, and it almost contributed to a kind of perfect storm when this instances of police violence and inappropriate behavior emerged. So the communities have begun to respond. And I think there's a new level of conviction and anger because we have been here before. That Groundhog Day syndrome haunts us. But I think there's an exclamation point now, in part because of this Corona, that set of factors, a sense of futility and desperation, a sense of we can't participate in the American dream and the promise that it offers, that we are not respected. Our contributions to America and building American wealth have generally been ignored, taken for granted, overlooked. And so this really is a new level and time of reckoning, I think. And I'm hopeful that if moral leadership, leaders with integrity, with courage and imagination step into this moment and begin to talk about this American promise, the American dream in some new ways, we will respond in a compelling way, I think, to what Alexis de Tocqueville, you know him as the 19th century French traveler, observer, writing about this early American civilization. And he wrote this wonderful quote that I use in chapter 4 of the book. He said, "The greatness of America lies in not that she is more enlightened than any other nation. The greatness of America lies in her ability to repair her faults." And that phrase, I wonder how it strikes you. The greatness of America is in her ability to repair her faults. So this is a moment for us to reckon with, yes, discrete bad behavior by police officers. But more broadly, we're talking about the impact of both individualized race bias, race hatred, racism, but also institutionalized. And the question, I think, for us as a PathNorth community, and Doug has been leading us into these uncomfortable places, is what can we do in our zones, in our circles of friends, in our communities where often these topics are ignored or are minimized, or, you know, they serve as a kind of painful distraction. I think this is a moment where America really has to work through this in a courageous, imaginative way. The eyes of the world are on us. And I hope that PathNorth, the work we're doing, can contribute in some small way to that. So I'll stop there, Doug. David, thank you.
Thank you. That was brilliant, Dr. Franklin. Really, I have a couple questions, and we're going to open it up for others, if that would be okay. First, I'd like to ask you, Bob, are you surprised by this moment? Did you feel like, because I think a lot of people feel like, wow, we had an African-American president for 2 terms. You know, haven't we moved beyond this? But in a funny way, when you read the 1963 letter from, you know, Dr. King, nothing's changed, and that's 57 years ago. So what is it? Have we moved forward, Bob, or are we still stuck in a paradigm? What do you say about that?
Yeah, I was not surprised. I think one writer said in today's, I think it was the Los Angeles Times, that while we are all horrified, it's really the white population that gets to be shocked by this, while African Americans, other people of color, are certainly horrified and share the sense of horror that all Americans, but some you know, friends who have perhaps been more distant from some of these realities in our communities are really shocked that we watch, in this case, a police officer assisted by others, ignored by others, not held accountable by his colleagues. For several minutes, we watched the life dissipate, and what some call a murder, what some call an execution, whatever labels you think appropriate. This is not altogether shocking to many of us who live with those stories, who have seen that kind of both state violence as well as citizen violence of the sort we saw with Trayvon Martin, and more recently here in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery. So no, but I think, you know, again, I'm always thinking, what are the solutions? What are the next steps? And Dr. King wrote very compellingly about 2 institutions in American life that should play a significant role in helping to turn the corner. He talked about the Supreme Court and government institutions, but especially the courts, as sort of these more objective, relatively objective arbiters of what is good and right and true and just. He believed in the Supreme Court. And the second were houses of worship. He pleaded for synagogues and temples, mosques and churches to step up and set the tone at the top for our communities. But one of the things I talk about in the book is that, yes, it's important, and most of us here we are CEOs. We have our retired CEOs. We have led institutions. We set the tone at the top. But then there's also the conversation about what is the mood in the middle. So there's the tone at the top, but the mood in the middle, and listening, who are middle managers? Are they diverse? Are they listening to their workers? Do they reflect our communities and our customer bases? But then in addition to the tone at the top, the mood in the middle, there's the buzz at the bottom. And the need for us to listen, back to Doug's point, to what's happening at the bottom of the pyramid, if you will. And it was heartening to me, and talk about moral leadership, to see a police chief Arundel in Minneapolis, go out among the people to listen. So,
That's great.
yeah.
No, thank you. But a couple other quick ones. So what would you want us to know, and what practically could we do?
Well, certainly making sure that you are aware and smart, and your organizations and companies are aware and smart about the importance of being literate in these issues of race and difference. How would you rate the level of race literacy in your company, in your organization, on your team, in your extended networks, in your houses of worship? Race and difference literacy. And I think, fortunately, we have a terrific literature now that can help inform that. I was listening today to one author, Robin DiAngelo. She's written a wonderful book titled White Fragility, why white people don't like to talk about race. And I really appreciate Ms. DiAngelo's honesty about that. I use that book in a course that I co-taught with a white colleague at Emory this year on Black and White in America. That single book, small book, was the most popular of all that we read. We read Du Bois and all sorts of terrific work. So White Fragility is one I recommend. There's so many others. There are leaders, in fact, on this call, great guy down in North Carolina, another Tar Heel, Sterling Freeman, is leading some of that work, and Errol Davis at Chautauqua. So I think there are resources there, Doug, and maybe that's something we ought to explore, how we might address this in a more systematic way.
I was actually thinking, Bob, and this came to me when the call started, that I'd love for people to send me an email on this. I almost feel like we ought to have a kind of an ongoing tutorial, maybe about 5 of these, where we can really, you can raise any question ahead of time. You put it down and we start to address these things, but we really try to do a deep dive and truly try to understand and get our arms around this. The last thing I'd say before I open up, what keeps you hopeful during this time? You've seen this movie. You walked with Dr. King. You have been a part of this conversation for so long. You've seen, at Morehouse, young men who have had horrific experiences. I mean, I was talking to an African American a few days ago about what happened in Central Park, where that young man was called, the investment banker, the female, called the police and said, "I'm going to accuse you of attacking me," when he hadn't. He just wanted her to put a dog on a leash. Yeah. And he said to me, if this had happened 30 years ago, there's a possibility, fairly strong, that he would have been lynched. And you say, that can't be true. But I think it shows how reality is perceived very differently, depends on where you sit. But what keeps you hopeful, Bob? And then I'm going to open it up.
Yeah, just imagine, before I respond to that, how vulnerable people of color have been over these decades and centuries without the benefit of video evidence. It's just vulnerability. Someone has said privilege, one definition of privilege is not having to think about the color of your skin every single day of your life, every hour of your life. That's a privilege. And, I think we've made significant strides. I think many people overreached and overclaimed the significance of the Obama phenomena. It was a phenomenon. It says a lot about the greatness of this nation that occurred, and that those leaders were in the White House. But if we didn't somehow launch into a post-racial society, as some tried to suggest, we still have these challenges, and they lie in the heart and still in many of our institutions. That's why King said we got to deal with court systems and law and good policy, as well as change of the heart. And that's where I was listening, Jane Fonda last night, so how important it is to have a circle of friends that are diverse and different, that can bring you bring us all perspectives that challenge us. So I am hopeful, made hopeful by, ironically, the diversity of the young people in the streets protesting. Not the bad behavior, criminal behavior, looting, destruction, dishonoring, according to our mayor, Mayor Bottoms here in Atlanta, dishonoring George Floyd's life, but those who have committed to nonviolent, peaceful change, because young white youth, along with Latino, Asian, African American, others are standing together saying, that's the America we believe in, we want to be a part of. So they're there. We've highlighted them in past PathNorth experiences. They give me hope.
Great, Bob. So let's open it up here, and some of you have typed some questions in. I am so technologically impaired that I don't know how to retrieve those. So you might want to speak those, or Seth, if you have those, or Adam, you can maybe read a couple of those.
Yeah, for sure, Doug. So I can read this one from Greg Boyson for Bob. Bob, given the complexity of the situation, do you believe that the income inequality in our nation plays a large role in the anger that we are seeing during this unrest?
Oh, short answer, without a doubt. Thanks for reading that. And thank you, Greg Boyson, terrific media and public intellectual expert. This is, we're seeing, and I think COVID has already sort of exposed the vulnerability of millions of our fellow Americans, the desperation that people have, the standing in line, folks that I've thought would never, who they say, I would never be in a food line seeking food and resources for my family. There they are. So that kind of vulnerability is now more widely shared. It was certainly pervasive in many ethnic minority communities. I hope that this is a moment where we really take that on in a significant way and deal not only with the kind of income inequality and the work opportunities and the collapse of that, our economy. I hope it will turn around in the way that many of our leaders are suggesting, but also the public health crisis. My wife, Cheryl, is working in this area, very concerned about those disparities. The lack of access to healthcare and medical care makes so many good people, loving people, make a tremendous contribution to our nation. They're dying, and so many on the front line in healthcare. So this really needs to be a pivot moment. This is an exclamation point because we've got COVID and these kind of conflicts of class, race, and difference. And I think as moral leadership emerges amidst this morass, I think exciting things can happen.
Good. Seth, another question, please. Okay.
You're muted. Okay.
All right, I'll ask a question. This is Adam. What would you have policymakers think about? I have a rare opportunity to be close with our current Ohio governor. What would you have us think about well-intentioned white men who too often make wrong decisions? I remember I hosted a panel discussion on African-American entrepreneurs, and half of them were offended that I separated them into the African-American entrepreneur category. Yeah. They want to just be entrepreneurs. So be blunt and coach people like us about some of this.
Yeah, thanks so much for your candor there, Adam. And I must say that, there are people who are more skilled in this area, but as one, part of my vantage point is that I presided over an institution that had 2,000 young African-American men. And they were all upwardly mobile and aspiring, but some of those kids, as Doug acknowledged, and he was on my board, some of those kids had been homeless. Some of them, they were writing their college applications. I spent last year living out of my automobile. And now they're at Morehouse, and they become these amazing, amazing leaders. So I would say that the policymakers should gather to reimagine. I think, as Doug is saying, rethinking successes, reimagining the good Ohio, the good Minnesota, and on down the line across the board in this nation. I hope that just as after the '68 riots, after King's assassination, what emerged? A significant commission to study the causes of disorder. And that Kerner Commission is worth going back because, you know, it was pretty much put on a shelf and ignored for subsequent decades. And that's the tragedy. But I think, you know, I would plead for our president to create such a commission of diverse leaders who come together to examine the causes of disorder. And they would focus on precisely the issues we're naming here and probably won't have time to get to today. But we also have some foundation stones to stand on. So for instance, the Commission on 21st Century Policing, you Google that. I mean, that was an extraordinary collection of leaders that led to very tangible change. New Jersey, for instance, the superintendent of police chiefs in New Jersey bonded with the head of the NAACP state branch of New Jersey, and they began to ensure that police officers and local chiefs experienced racial bias training and implicit bias training sponsored by the NAACP, and NAACP leaders had to undergo training for police in difficult situations, use of force training. And so it was amazing learning that happened across. And the learning needs to happen.
Great stuff, Bob.
I would also say, pay attention to Ken Frazier at Merck and what he's doing. He was on CNBC
today, yeah.
That's great. That's
Hi,
great.
Robert.
Thank you.
David Motley, how are you?
Yes, great, thanks.
Really appreciate your message on integrity, courage, and imagination. Look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
A question for you in particular, because you are at least a couple months, if not a couple years older than I am, and seem to have both the benefit of the tragic experience of having lived through what happened 50 years ago in the 60s, and now this revisiting and reliving of a very similar situation in 2020, one which my mother said her biggest regret is that she had hoped her grandkids would only hear about this from her as she recounted history. I'm really curious when I think about the voices in the 60s that rose above the clamor, the voice of a Dr. King, the voice of the NAACP, the voice of Black leaders who were able to really rise above the fray. And yes, we have some examples of some voices out there, but there seems to be a void where there is a voice that's more than equal within our community that is able to drive the kind of following that and reverence that was held back in the 60s. I'm just curious as to your perspective on that and where you see there might be an opportunity or a way for somebody, whether it be a person or an organization, to step into this breach and become that voice?
Wow, great question. And David, thank you for your work. I've enjoyed you at PathNorth and other gatherings where I've encountered you. We haven't even gotten to know each other yet. I am so grateful for that because you point to an exercise that I highlight in the book. It's a Mount Rushmore exercise. I asked students to identify 4 living, so it's easy to glorify those who have departed, but 4 people who are alive today from different sectors who you regard to be moral leaders. And again, who is it that possesses these virtues of integrity, of courage, of imagination, who serve the common good, not just their own sort of constituents and zip code, common good, and who invite others to join them, who are inclusive. So those are the 3 elements of my definition that I outlined. And 4 leaders. And what's remarkable to me, Dave, is they always identify 2 kind of large figures. For instance, the most recent, just this past semester at Emory, Dr. Anthony Fauci, name emerged quite a bit, the lawyer Brian Stevenson, emerged often. We're beginning to hear some public leaders like Governor DeWine in Ohio and like Tim Walz of Governor Cuomo, of Minnesota and New York, respectively. So it was interesting. But while they would name two sort of fairly famous people, they would typically name two who were unknown to anyone in the class, in the seminar. It was one of those my grandmother stories, or someone in your life no one else knows, but this is a person making a difference, an inspiring virtue. It's just that sense where two or three are gathered, they can kind of turn around an army of angry people. But they have to be willing to put their body on the line. And it's that faith, that call of faith and conviction. My grandmother didn't know what might happen out there in the streets. Those people are here. 3 days ago, when the unfolding of violence here in the streets of Atlanta, my first call was to Ambassador Andrew Young, and fortunately I caught him. And I said, Andy, I just have to, how are you doing? I want to check on you and your spirit, because you've been so important to so many of us. And I could hear his wife interrupting. She didn't want him to get on a call with the media, I'm sure. And he said, yeah, I'm talking about Franklin. It's okay. So, but Andy said, he just felt the heaviness of this moment. And we talked about how COVID, we were working hard to sort of help manage that and get especially African-American communities to be serious about steps we need to take to flatten that curve. He said, then this occurs. So those leaders are there. I'll just stop there.
Thank you.
That is great. One quick question here. Someone's been trying to ask the whole time, and then a quick answer, Bob, because we have to wrap up.
Yeah. So Doug, there's I have a few questions left.
You can bundle those maybe, and I'll just offer.
Yeah, why don't you read them all, and maybe Bob
Yeah, so
can.
I'll give you the first one from Lisa Martin. She was curious if you could speak at all to an organization called Showing Up for Racial Justice, which she is seeing some of her friends joining. Yeah. And then we had a question from Rick Stevenson, piggybacking on Adam's question of what would a post-racial world look like if we're trying to, celebrate both likeness and unity while also celebrating diversity and difference?
Wow, big questions. I know a little about the organization. I don't know much. I want to learn more. I've been hearing of them and others around the country, but I think this is a time for us to identify those resources in our communities, Lisa, so thank you. And I hope maybe you could even put that name in the chat. I hope, Doug, we can save the chat, and you all should check it, because their friends have offered some great resources and links to websites that might be valuable.
Yeah,
this is not going to go away, folks. We're going to live with this. And so let's all become more literate on the race difference, class issues. And let's keep in mind that moral leadership is the single most important variable that will make a difference for our future.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Awesome. I'm hoping that as you all respond to this conversation today, you will urge us to do more of this and maybe have a 101 session where we can really talk through your questions in a more fulsome way. So Bob is what Baynard Ruskin called an angelic troublemaker. He is stirred the pot today, and that's what I hope we all are accused of that. I'll close with one last thought. It's really hard to go against our friends, go against our cultural shapers and all these things that are so have shaped us into who we are. But I think we have to find out who is our audience at the end of the day. Who are we living to please? And, this is where our spiritual grounding is really important in my mind. Because at the end of the day, we've got to live, as the Quakers were fond of saying, to live to please an audience of one. So that will enable us to do the right thing, because it makes life really simple. There's one audience, period. So Bob, this, as Dale said, you didn't choose this moment, but God chose you to be here for us. Thank you all for joining us. And I'll turn it to Seth to mention some of the things that are coming up on the next week. So Seth, would you just briefly tell us, and then we'll bid adieu.
Most certainly. So this upcoming Wednesday, June 3rd at 1:30 p.m., we'll have our weekly PathNorth community call with Dr. Rick Stevenson. Many of you will recall Dr. Rick Stevenson from our 2019 annual gathering in Washington, D.C., where he's interviewed over 5,500 children and students, youth across the world.
See you later.
Their patterns. And then the following Wednesday will be a conversation with the CEO and president of Communities in Schools, Ray Saldana, which should be a really interesting conversation on our current state of education in this country.
Great. Okay, so remember what Bob said. We need people of integrity, compassion, and imagination. We need new solutions that have never been envisioned before. Thank you all for this time. Stay hopeful. We can do this. We can do this.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank
Great
you.
job.
you all.
Thanks.
Thank you, John
Thanks,
and Margaret.
Bob. Great to
Thanks.
see you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
We really appreciate it. And the next Civility Lunch will be July 6th, Monday, the first Monday in July. And put that on your calendar, and we look forward to seeing you all at that time after we celebrate the nation's birthday. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you all.
Yes.